Good morning, everyone. I'm Edo Berger, faculty co-director of the science program at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute and professor of astronomy in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I am thrilled to welcome you today to the Mike and Nina Patterson Science Symposium, A Pale Blue Dot Under Pressure: Climate Change, Justice, and Resilience in Our Rapidly Warming World. It is particularly rewarding to celebrate the return to an in-person format for our annual Science Symposium for the first time in 3 years. It is great to see so many real people here in the audience, as well as to welcome those joining us virtually from all over the world. We are here today to learn about and discuss climate change, one of, if not the most significant threats facing our planet today. Climate change affects life on Earth in countless ways, from warming temperatures and increasing weather disasters to water shortages, from global to personal health to our mental well-being, from destruction of ecosystems and rapid species extinction to impacts on small businesses, from threats to global security to neighborhood food insecurity, and from international policies to individual decision-making. And every one of these effects, and many others, exacerbates underlying patterns of inequality. As noted so emphatically by the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report, human-induced climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people across sectors and regions. The most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected. As a local example, a recent City of Boston heat resilience study from just over a year ago documented up to 10-degree temperature difference both during the day and during the night across our city, only a 7 miles diameter area. And those temperature differences directly map onto historical patterns of bank loan redlining, racial disparities, and lack of investment in infrastructure and green spaces. As we hear about the latest in climate change science today, these critical considerations of inequity will be woven throughout the conversation. None of the scientific considerations or the effects of climate change can be considered alone. We must understand the different local and global contexts in which the science and attempts to mitigate the effect of climate change are taking place. Challenges and impacts differ by region, country, city, even neighborhood. To help save our planet, it is essential that we consider and support populations that are particularly vulnerable and not just the resource-rich or industrialized parts of the world. This Science Symposium also serves as the kickoff event for a multi-year climate change initiative here at Radcliffe that we are incredibly excited about. This initiative is an effort to explore the impacts of climate change and climate crisis through an interdisciplinary lens and to address issues of climate justice, particularly the disproportionate effects on marginalized communities, both locally and globally. At the heart of this work is Radcliffe's commitment to supporting and sharing research that promotes innovative solutions and greater equity. This initiative reflects Radcliffe's bedrock commitment to interdisciplinary study, informed by an equally deep dedication to inclusion. We firmly believe that these approaches will generate valuable new insights into effective and equitable ways of addressing the climate change problem. The Radcliffe Institute will support research on issues as varied as reducing human-caused climate change, developing public education on the causes and consequences of the climate crisis, and mitigating the effects of climate change, particularly on the most vulnerable. Today's symposium will bring this multidisciplinary approach into stark relief. The symposium is divided into 5 sessions that bring together experts across the many facets of climate change. From those on the forefront of studying and documenting the climate system, to those on the front lines of advocating for climate justice and critical policies. From those studying the personal and global health impacts, to those working on current and future adaptation and remediation technologies and implementation plans. Before we begin, I would like to give you a quick outline of today's program. Our first session will frame the topic of climate change and its global impacts from the perspective of an international climate reporter. Our second session will turn to a discussion of the global climate system and the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events. Then, after a short break, our third session will explore climate justice and activism, bringing together several voices from the front lines of critical advocacy, community, and policy work. After a lunch break, we will hear brief remarks from Jim Stock, Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability and Director of the newly established Salada Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard. Following Jim's remarks, we will turn to the fourth session, focused on the many health impacts of rapidly changing climate, ranging from those that affect individual well-being to global health, with a particular emphasis on vulnerable communities. Finally, after another short break, we will conclude with a discussion of adaptation and remediation, namely what technologies, policies, and personal decisions will be crucial to adapt to the ongoing consequences of climate change and how to best reduce its long-term impacts. Our panelists will provide a broad perspective spanning from technology to global approaches to our own city of Boston. Following the short individual presentations in each session, there will be a moderated conversation as well as time for audience Q&A. Audience members, both here in person and those online, are welcome to submit questions during each session throughout the program. And our panelists will get to as many of them as they can. Whether you are here in person or watching online, please submit questions using the Slido link that is provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. Before I turn things over to our first session speaker and moderator, I would like to offer some thanks. First, I'm grateful to my fellow science co-director, Immaculata De Vivo, who we will hear from later in the program. Thank you as well to the Radcliffe Institute staff for all their hard work, especially the academic ventures and engagement team led by Becky Wasserman and the events team led by Jessica Vickland. And of course, I want to acknowledge the distinguished group of panelists and moderators joining us today. Thanks to all of you. And lastly, I'd like to particularly thank our supporters and friends, Mike and Nina Patterson, whose generosity has made this symposium possible. Mike and Nina, who are with us today, are dedicated volunteers and champions of the Institute's work, as well as that of the broader university. We thank them for their support and personal commitment to the critical issue of climate change. So, without further ado, I will now invite Somini Sengupta and Dustin Tingley to the stage for our first session. Dustin is a professor of government in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, as well as deputy vice provost for advances in learning at Harvard. He will offer a few remarks and introduce Somini, our first featured speaker. Dustin, the floor is yours.
Greetings and thanks. Thanks to the Radcliffe Institute's leadership and the great team supporting this. We're really excited for today. I am thrilled to get to introduce Somini Sengupta. She's the international climate reporter for the New York Times, which all of you know already. Prior to this, she has assignments as bureau chief in West Africa, South Asia, and the United Nations. And now a lot of her reporting focuses on what we're here to talk about today. Somini was awarded the George Polk Award for International Reporting in 2004 and published her first book, The End of Karma, Hope and Fury Among India's Young, in 2016. It's a fantastic read. The range and depth of her reporting is extraordinary. In just the past month, and you can go on the New York Times website on her author page to see this, in just the past month, she's reported on topics as varied as the controlled fires in California, King Charles's environmental credentials, heat pumps in New York City, debates over the use of gas in African countries, extreme debt borne by low and middle income countries after extreme weather disasters, the effects of elections in Australia, Britain, Brazil, and the US, and the links between climate change and world hunger. And then throw in a really interesting story about fungi in forests. I should also say that Somini is not only a household name to scholars throughout the world studying climate change. She's also deeply respected in this community. Furthermore, and more importantly, she's a household name to households across the world. Indeed, her captivating, analytical, and yet deeply humane approach to reporting is valued and embraced. Indeed, my mom was tickled pink last night when I told her what I was going to do this morning. But I don't think that's going to be a Twitter follower you're going to pick up today. Before we begin, audience members are welcome to submit questions at any time. So anytime, keep them flowing when Somini's talking, as we're talking, at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many as we can. Whether you're watching in person or online, you can submit your questions through the Slido link. You take the QR code, or there's some instructions there. Again, this is an opportunity to get the audience involved. So with this, I am truly honored to introduce Somini Sengupta.
Hi, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. I am truly humbled to be here. I hope this can be the beginning of a really rich and purposeful conversation today. I'd like you to meet Desiree Alele. I met her in Manila a few years ago when I was reporting a story on sea level rise. Desiree grew up in a neighborhood that was sinking. The land was literally subsiding in that part of the city because of development decisions made over the years. All the while, the sea was rising. So every time there was a storm surge, heavy rains, her neighborhood would flood. And the streets would just slosh with water, waist-high water. The city dealt with it by raising the road. And how did Desiree's family deal with it? By borrowing money to raise their house, which is why it's raised on a series of these cement blocks. She was a new mother when I met her. She had a newborn son, and she told me she did not want this life for her child. She had found an apartment in a better neighborhood. She and her husband were keen to move there, where her child wouldn't have to wade through the water to get to school, where the family wouldn't have to borrow money to raise the house every few years. Except there was one problem. Her elderly parents, who watched the baby while Desiree and her husband went to work, did not want to move. This was their home. They knew people here. They weren't leaving. For the same story on sea level rise, I went to the other side of the Pacific, to a very different city dealing with the same problem, sea level rise, the San Francisco Bay Area. It had just passed a $425 million municipal bond to fortify the seawall to protect this beautiful Embarcadero. The airport was getting a new makeover to protect it from sea level rise, and people who owned homes along the coast, much of it also eroding, had homeowners insurance. And when I spoke to them, many of them were also intent on staying, never mind the rising sea. How you face the rising sea depends mostly on the accident of your birth, I wrote in that story. Whether you were born rich or poor, in a wealthy country or a struggling one, whether you have insurance or not, whether your property is worth millions or is little more than a tin roof. I tell you this story about San Francisco and Manila because it encapsulates for me some of the themes that I've picked up, some of the lessons that I've learned writing about the human toll of climate change. Lesson one, we are clearly living on a hotter planet. The average global temperature is about 1.1 degrees Celsius higher today than it was 150 years ago at the beginning of the industrial era. That's nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the baseline, the average. Imagine your body temperature on average being 2 degrees Fahrenheit higher. That's where we're at right now. That's mainly, of course, because of the combustion of coal and oil and gas for 150 years to light up our streets, to heat our homes, to build these buildings, to get us from one place to another, to have a refrigerator at home so milk doesn't spoil. This extra heat in the atmosphere, this average rising of temperatures, is also making heat waves more extreme, storms more extreme, packing more rain and cyclones and hurricanes, spreading wildfires. So there is no question we are living on a hotter planet. However, how much hotter a planet we will live on? Will it be on average 1.5 degrees hotter? Will it be on average 3 degrees hotter? That story is still being written. We are all writing that story. The future is not foretold. There are many futures possible. Those futures hinge on the choices made by CEOs, bankers, presidents, prime ministers, but also on the choices that those powerful men and women are compelled to make by shareholders, by customers, by voters. Did I say voters? So lesson one, we're living on a hotter planet already, no question. That makes it imperative to learn how to live on a hotter planet, how to adapt, including people like Desiree, including people like me, including all of us. Here's one way to visualize where we're at right now. And this is just carbon dioxide emissions, not methane, not other greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. Look how sharply they've gone up since 1990. Look at how fast that curve moves. If you're a student, and I see some very young people in this audience, you might think that that's a long time. That's like basically my adult lifetime. It's not a long time in the scale of human history. And that curve has gone up very, very sharply in my adult lifetime. Incidentally, we have packed all of those carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere since the creation of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. That also happened in 1990. So lesson two, the story of climate change is a story not just of parts per million, not just of degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit, but it's a story about people. It's a story about people like Desiree. And it's a story about inequity. Here's one way to visualize that globally. Countries representing 12% of the world population, rich countries, my country, we are responsible for half of the emissions in the atmosphere today, creating the extreme weather that we're already encountering. The impacts of this warming is acutely felt by those who are, by and large, not responsible. The most stark recent example of that probably came this year from India and Pakistan. Both countries witnessed extraordinary heat waves this summer, and then, of course, in Pakistan came these rains, these extraordinary rains that just wouldn't stop, inundating a third of the country, affecting 33 million people. I mean, the scale of it is almost too large to, hold in your head. So this is one way to visualize it. Another way to visualize it is through the eyes of this woman who I met and wrote about, Briseida Flores. Briseida and I met during a heat wave in the Central Valley of California. Briseida was a college student at the time, and she was also a farm worker. And so when I met her, she and her mom were going to work in the fields at 4:30 in the morning in the dark because it was still cool. By mid-morning, it was too hot to keep going into those tight, suffocating rows of corn. There was a wildfire burning further north, and soon there was so much smoke, toxic smoke, in the air that the local air pollution agency issued a health alert. Climate change exposes the very sharp inequities within our countries and between our countries, among our countries. If you're poor, you're likely to be more vulnerable to extreme heat. You might be unable to afford an air conditioner. You might not even have electricity when you need it. You may have no choice but to work outdoors under a sun so blistering that first your knees feel weak, and then delirium sets in. Or the heat might bring a drought so punishing that no matter how hard you work under the sun, your corn withers and your children turn to you in hunger. That's from a story I wrote in 2020. It was part of a series called Inequity at the Boiling Point, and I would invite you, if you're interested, to look that up. Slowing down climate change requires turning the entire global economy from the thing that powers it, coal, oil, and gas. This is lesson 3. And just a note on the verb. I struggle with what verb to use. I don't really use fighting climate change. It's not something you do battle with. I don't use solving climate change because that train has left the station, can't solve it, really? So for now, for today, I'm using slowing down. So I'm sticking to that. So slowing down climate change requires turning the entire global economy away from the thing that powers it. This is a historic shift. It requires a massive redesign in everything we do, how we turn the lights on, feed each other, how we move around, how we live, where we live, how we organize our communities, so that it can ease human suffering and not exacerbate it, which is what's happening currently. The shift is not happening fast enough. Very clearly, the scientific consensus says that curve, that emissions curve, has to bend really fast in this decade, by 2030, to avert, for us to have the best chance to avert the worst impacts of climate change. We're not doing that. However, there is a clear direction of change, as slow and fitful as it is. And I want to give you just a couple examples. Of all the new electricity capacity that was built in 2021, that was added in 2021, the vast majority was renewables. Yes, there are still coal plants being built, largely in China and India. There are still licenses being issued for new drilling and fracking, but of all the new stuff being built to produce electricity, most of that is coming from solar and wind and hydro. There's also a clear direction of change in transportation and how we move around. Yes, you've read a lot about electric vehicles being made by lots of different car makers, but the thing that I'm really watching is this: the electrification of two-wheelers, bicycles, motorcycles, the electrification of three-wheelers, rickshaws, the electrification of public transit, buses, because that's how the vast majority of the world gets around, not in electric cars. China is furthest along in electrifying buses. Trams are making a comeback in many European cities, including Berlin. West Berlin had ripped up all its tram lines after the war. It's putting them back in. I have a thing for trams. I kind of like them, so every city I go to, I just ride the tram. I wrote a story last year about how cities are electrifying transit, and this was my absolute favorite example. This is Bogota, and this is an electric cable car in Bogota. And if you look, you'll see that there's a solar panel that's to power the Wi-Fi. And at first I completely nerded out, and I thought, well, that's a cool climate solution. But really, it's just a solution for people who commute every day from these working people who live in these neighborhoods up in the hills. They have to come down to the valley to work. And this cable car makes their commute more pleasant, faster, cheaper. And this is increasingly what I'm hearing from people who are trying to make this massive redesign, is that if the sustainable option is the nicer one, the healthier one, the cheaper option, well, then it's more likely to be embraced, right? If it's a boutique, more expensive, virtuous option, maybe not so much. Lesson 4. Slowing down climate change requires a lot of money. Especially the debate now is especially the money that rich countries promised they would give to poor countries. Dustin and I were talking about this earlier. This was baked into the Paris Agreement. The historic emitters, industrialized countries, had promised to give money to emerging economies and poor countries, low-income countries, to shift their economies away from coal, to help them adapt to the warming that's already baked in, and most contentiously, to pay for irreversible losses and damages. Some of the things that are happening to the countries that are not the historic emitters. So the idea is climate reparations, but in the polite diplo-speak of UN negotiations, it's called loss and damage. And I wrote about this last year from the climate talks in Glasgow, where it was really heating up. It is going to be a major flashpoint in this year's negotiations that start in 2 weeks. Compounding all of this now is a war. And this is my final observation, a war financed by Russia's oil and gas and coal riches, of course, a war in which those very fossil fuels have been used as a weapon. This has complicated global efforts to tackle climate change. It has spawned what is probably the first real global energy crisis, right? We had an oil crisis, but not a wholesale energy crisis. It has spawned a food crisis. It has exacerbated human suffering. All the while, oil and gas companies are reporting windfall profits. I learned from a Bloomberg story that banks are actually lending more money to fossil fuel companies this year than last year. But here, too, the future is not foretold. Because in the name of energy security, which is so important to so many important countries right now, in the name of energy security, will countries be persuaded to double down on extracting more oil and gas and coal in their lands and waters, or will this compel countries to pivot away faster from an economy based on fossil fuels? This is really the great tension of this moment. How this is resolved will shape your future and mine. So the big question now is, will this conflict slow down climate action or accelerate it? And here, too, many futures are possible. This is what we write about twice a week in the New York Times Climate Forward newsletter. It's available to subscribers, and I invite you to sign up, nytimes.com/climateforward, and we'll land in your inbox every Tuesday and Friday. With that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Somini. That was great. So before we begin with a little conversation, I wanted to remind folks to post their questions to the Slido app. I know it can be really hard to think of questions when you're sitting through such a captivating presentation, but I hope that you can do that, and that'll help bring out the conversation. So, Somini, you know, as I said in my opening remarks, you just cover such a broad swath of topics in this space. And I can't help but wonder if there are areas that you see as being sort of untilled, untapped, a story needs to be told. And whether it's something that you're going to write on or that our students here should be sort of inquiring about, where do you see some of the areas and opportunities that you think are just going to be really ripe for the type of stories and analysis that you're renowned for?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I can't help but write about a broad array of subjects because, by definition, climate change touches everything. It's not its own silo. You know, it affects business, it affects agriculture, it affects architecture. it has inspired incredible art. So what do I want to write about? I want to write about everything. I don't have time to write about everything. What I would love to hear from students, from faculty members interested in this area is, how do we live now? What are some glimpses of things that people are doing, real people, mayors, entrepreneurs, community activists, to get us on this big shift, right? This redesign. I want to meet the people who are redesigning. I want to learn what is working, what is not, what their challenges are. That's what I want to, in every area of life, in how you design hospitals for the future, or how you grow food on a hotter planet.
So one of the things that I really like about that, and I think it's something that some scholars don't do enough of, is really getting out and being on the front line and talking to these people that are looking for solutions. There's this expression that a friend of mine uses about solution aversionism. So people that sort of are denying that climate change is happening, but really under the surface, it's that they are averse to the types of solutions that some are either foisting upon them, or they just don't see themselves in that future. And yet, at the same time, there are opportunities, right? And there are opportunities not just for communities that might be traditionally in fossil fuels, but also others. One of the things that you brought up is about electrification, just more generally. And I get really excited about electrification as a political scientist because jobs. How is that coming up? There's the sort of more pleasant, faster, cheaper, but that's kind of on the consumer side. How does electrification as a job engine come up when you're having these conversations?
Yeah, I recently wrote a story about the very exciting topic of heat pumps. But really, it was about an entrepreneur in Brooklyn whose company used to do conversions from heating oil to gas for people's to heat people's buildings and for their boilers. So a lot of New York City buildings were still pouring like heating oil into the boilers in the basement, and it would be super dirty. It would break down, and so this entrepreneur, this company, was first kind of shifting them from heating oil to gas, natural gas. And then his son was born, and he had an epiphany. And he said, I'm shifting them to gas, which is better than oil, but it means that gas is going to be in there for 30, 40 years when my kid is my age. I don't want to do that anymore. So really, it was a story about him, right? It wasn't really a story about heat pumps. It was a story about him, and it was a story about what then he decided to do was to kind of shift the business to installing heat pumps. And he very soon discovered that there just aren't enough workers to do that. And so part of his business is in training workers. So it only dawned on me then that we really are talking about, when we talk about, putting up EV charging stations all over this country, electrifying buildings, when we talk about plugging everything in, we're really talking about training a brand new workforce also. And there's a big question as to whether this can be done equitably, whether women and men will have opportunities in this workforce, whether people of color will have equal opportunities in this workforce for training. So I do think that, especially with the money that's coming in through the Inflation Reduction Act and through the infrastructure bill, both of those things could potentially train a lot of workers. And so questions of equity will come up.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you are bringing up the equity piece because, the work of others and some of the stuff that I've been drawing on really highlights how even in some of these newer sort of greener sectors, there is profound inequity. Women are a fraction of the workforce compared to men, persons of color. We were interviewing recently a program at North Carolina State University that does work on training people for the renewable. We asked them these questions, and there was an interesting observation, which was
That's a story.
but it's going to be in my book.
People will read your book forever. They'll read a story and wrap fish in it.
No. People won't read my book in it. But they made a very interesting remark, which was part of the problem is that people need to see themselves in that future. And if they don't see people like them, they don't see themselves in that future, and they don't want to make that jump. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is an area where, it's kind of like you get stuck in a trap, right? It's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. And, I hope that we can start to figure out, how to do that, how to make it cool to be an electrician, for example. Mm-hmm. Whereas maybe in some educational environments, that doesn't always exist. Let me pivot to a question that then is more on the sort of education side of things. Where do you see sort of education, not just in this country, but, given your sort of footprint internationally, is there anything exciting that you think our educational institutions or the government structures that sit around our education institutions should really be pushing on, whether it's electrification or anything else in this domain?
I mean, I just have a question, and I don't know the answer to this. What are schools teaching about climate change? I actually don't know. I can sense that young people, by and large, are extremely interested and extremely concerned. But I would like to know, what are schools teaching? I just learned recently that there are university humanities courses that also really do a deep dive on literature of the Anthropocene.
Yep.
Didn't know that. That's kind of cool. On what you were saying before, how do people imagine themselves in the future? I think that's really hard, and I'm interested in learning what is it about our brain, what is it about the way we think that makes this easier to defer rather than, run towards a future that we kind of don't know. And I think that there is, there's a sort of dilemma. Do we think about this as in a nostalgic way for a world that's vanishing, or do we think about this in an optimistic way, moving to a world that is fairer, healthier, more habitable? I think it's possible to hold both things in your head and your heart. But I confess, it's hard for me to think about 2030, right? I talk to scientists all the time, and 2030 is kind of that North Star year. If we're going to stay within the 1.5 target, emissions have to come down by 2030. And all I can think of is my kid going to graduate from college in 2030? And what's that world look like? Is she going to graduate from college? So I think that it's unfair maybe to expect us to imagine too far in the future, unless we are guided there, right?
Right. No, that's fascinating. Let me turn to another question from the audience, which is, you hear a lot these days about things like carbon sequestration, or even other things that are like geoengineering. So the idea that, geez, maybe we're going to have to turn down the temperature and things like aerosols can be sprayed in the atmosphere. And so these are real conversations, but there's a big kind of split about, does this induce just greater incentives to emit fossil fuels? So I hear this a lot when I talk to utility companies that use coal. And earlier in history, it was clean coal, except clean coal, that was about low sulfur coal, right? That was the first, and that was air pollution, right? Now it's clean coal, but we're going to figure out sequestration at some point, maybe, but let's spend a bunch of money. I'm just kind of curious about when you hear just more generally about techno fixes. Do you approach this with sort of pessimism, optimism? How do you balance those things out?
I will tell you, I try not to traffic in either hope or despair, but I'm a practical kind of auntie, And so I want to know what's working, what's not, how costly is it, does it make sense, is there something else that can be done? So, I want to know I know there's a lot of money going into geoengineering research, but I want to, the questions that I would ask are these, right? Is it realistic? What are the drawbacks? What would a global governance of this look like? Carbon sequestration, okay. Again, how expensive is it? Is there another way to do it that's less expensive? Will it be available to all countries, at different economic levels? So, and there was one more thing I was going to say about that. And really the main question is, does this make human life healthier, better? Does it make the planet habitable? There is, I know, a global overshoot commission that is looking at what happens if and when these temperature targets are overshot. What do we have to do? And they're considering a whole range of options. I imagine they're considering all of these options, and I look forward to seeing their report.
Yeah, no, they are.
That is a real possibility that we overshoot. And is that overshoot temporary, and then it's sort of brought back to the 1.5-ish, level?
We're about out of time. What's a sort of a closing remark that you'd like to sort of provide our community with?
I think two. What do you like to do? What can you do? What's your skill set? And if you're interested in climate, plug into it by doing what you like to do and doing what you're good at. And that might be building electrification. It might be, making incredibly provocative art. So do what you like to do.
And just do it. Ladies and gentlemen, Somini Sengupta.
Thank you.